Okay, while Catherine's doing that, let's get started with the panel. Good afternoon. As Doug mentioned, I'm Mark Squillace. I'm on the faculty here at the law school, longstanding interest in these water resource issues, and so I'm delighted to be able to moderate this panel, where we're continuing our discussion about water conservation kinds of issues. Many of you may have seen the story in the New York Times this morning, which I think was interesting and appropriate to this conference. Apparently, San Diego has agreed to sell some of its Colorado River water rights to Arizona and Nevada, and because they're getting more water than they need from their desalination plant that they have along the coast. Kind of an interesting strategy for how to sort of make more water at least available to the system. The story also actually talks about reclaiming sewage water from a number of cities, including Los Angeles, which of course is an interesting concept and idea, potentially resulting in consuming more water, which is something maybe we don't want to do, at least depending on where the sewage outflows are going. And so that's another way that we might be thinking about water conservation. All right, so we're just kind of continuing this discussion of conservation in this afternoon panel, and we have three great panelists to sort of help us through these issues. I wanted to just sort of mention that two of our panelists, the first two panelists that are going to be speaking, are two of our traveling Wilburys, and so if they happen to be in the middle of their presentation, if they start going into song, you'll know why. But of course, they're co-authors of that report that Doug mentioned this morning, an important report about updating the Colorado River storage basin issues. And so well worth a look on your part. So we're going to start this afternoon with Catherine Sorensen. Catherine is the Director of Research at the Kyle Center for Water Policy at Arizona State University. She's also served as the Director of Phoenix Water Services, and before that, as the Director of the City of Mesa's Water Resources Department. So obviously well qualified to talk with us about some conservation ideas. Catherine's going to be followed by Ann Castle, who many of you know, I'm sure. Ann is a senior fellow here at the Getches Wilkinson Center at the law school, at the University of Colorado Law School. And as you know, she's an expert on Colorado River policy kinds of issues, and served as the U.S. Commissioner and Chair of the Upper Colorado River Basin Commission between 2022 and 2025. And then finally, we're going to have Celine Hawkins, who is the Nature Conservancy's Colorado River Program Director. Celine leads the Conservancy's work that looks at restoration and protection of the Colorado River system. So I'm going to turn it over to Catherine, and we'll go from there. Thank you.
How's my mic? Good. Okay, clearly I'm not Bob Dylan. I identify as Tom Petty because before I went gray and while he was still alive, we had basically the same hair for decades. So, also, I want to thank Kenny for inviting me to speak again this year. After last year, I made all sorts of sarcastic jokes about all the lush green grass around this campus and the city of Boulder. I'm sorry about that, but you have a great sense of humor, and so thank you. I appreciate that. Okay. But more seriously, what I want to say to start off is that it just makes me sadder than words can really express that there just isn't enough water in the Colorado River Basin to do all the things that we want to do with it. I was up in the Pacific Northwest last summer, and I got to see Bonneville Dam for the first time. And when I saw how much water runs through the Columbia River, which, if you don't know, is 100 million acre-feet a year, I almost started crying. I wish so much that we didn't have to make the terribly painful decisions that we now have to make. I wish so much we didn't have to make these awful trade-offs. It makes me really sad. But here we are, and I do think that the trade-offs that we're going to have to make are horrible, and despite the best efforts of the negotiators, all of whom deserve just a huge amount of credit, despite the best efforts of all the irrigation districts and the cities and the tribes and all the people who have left water in Lake Mead and done their very best to conserve. We're at this really terrible moment. And I just, at this point, don't see how a greater conflict between urban and agricultural uses is avoidable. And that makes me really sad. And I just want to say that. Right about now, you guys are probably thinking like to yourselves like, wow, I don't like serious Catherine. I much prefer the Catherine that tells sarcastic jokes and shows funny slides, so I'm going to revert to that. And here's a picture that is apropos of absolutely nothing. It's just a palate cleanser and literally nothing else. Okay. While I'm very honored that Doug asked me to speak again this year, it was super nice, I'm bummed that he asked me to talk about ICS, or as I call it, assigned water, because I gotta tell you, despite having co-authored 3 papers on this, I find it unbelievably boring. It's just really tough. But for all that it is really boring, it is also super important. And it is important to understand that assigned water, or ICS, whatever you want to call it, is a major tenet of the 07 guidelines, nearly all the Mexican treaty minutes, the drought contingency plan, and now the proposed 3-state lower basin plan. So that means it's really important. And if you look carefully at the DCP and the lower basin proposal in particular, you will see that at some basic level, entities are willing to trade prior appropriation water for assigned water. So let that sink in. That means that at least under some conditions, maybe not all, but under some conditions, assigned water is at least as valuable, if not more valuable, than prior appropriation water. And why is it so valuable? Because to the entity that owns it, it's a lifeboat. It is a means to save up water during times when you maybe don't need it, and deploy it during times when you desperately need to. That is unequivocally a good thing. Unequivocally. It is a means of holding your water savings for use at a future time, rather than seeing those water savings go to the next user in a prior appropriation system. And that's valuable, of course, because in a prior appropriation system, as Tina mentioned, there is very little incentive to conserve because your conservation goes to the next user. You don't get the benefit of your conservation. So, of course, here we are, because of that, smack in the middle of the tragedy of the commons, right? So assigned water is a workaround of the prior appropriation system, and I mean that in a good way, in a positive way. Okay. The problem is ICS doesn't save water. It just moves it in time. And the problem is, of course, that right now we need to be drastically cutting uses. Even more that we have, those efforts have been incredibly, incredibly important. Kudos to everyone who's done that. It's probably not enough, and we need the upper basin to contribute even more as well. Hydrologic shortages aside, I get it, but we need to do more. Efforts to conserve water in one year and store it as assigned water in a subsequent year for delivery outside of the prior appropriation system creates flexibility and protection from shortage for the entity that owns the assigned water, but only moves demands in time. So that's really important to understand. Assigned water programs do not reduce overall Colorado River demands and do not significantly bolster collective resiliency or system reliability. And unfortunately, there's just not enough lifeboats to go around. right? It's a great lifeboat if you can get it. Okay. Those of you who know me know I am a total dork. I like math, I like Star Trek, I have a propensity to wear vests, which is just tragic, really. In The Wrath of Khan, Spock is dying, and Captain Kirk wants to save him, but Spock's like, no, man, sorry. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. And then in the sequel, which is The Search for Spock, for those of you who don't know, Captain Kirk risks it all to save Spock and says, the needs of the one outweigh the needs of the many. So profound. And honestly, that's how I feel about assigned water, right? Sometimes it's one and sometimes it's the other. And it's really difficult to find the right balance between individual and collective resilience on the Colorado River. It's hard. Okay, so stick with me. What if we could find a way to do this instead, okay? First of all, it's super fun. I mean, who doesn't want a floaty? I'm gonna throw out some ideas. Are they good ones? I mean, maybe, but also maybe not. But Doug challenged me to think of some of the best ways to use assigned water going forward, and this is the best I could come up with. Anna's gonna talk about assigned water in the upper basin, so I'm kind of focused on the lower basin here. Okay. All contractors and subcontractors are given an assignment that is equal to some measure of historic use. And yes, you can have all sorts of fights about what that means. Any water not ordered in a given year below that assignment becomes assigned water in that entity's name. And then we don't have to do all this arcane accounting that has been driving me crazy over the last 3 papers. The assigned water is operationally neutral and spills first, according to last in, first out. Assigned water is subject to evaporative losses, of course, and some reasonable assessment to help bolster system water. Assigned water space is allocated based proportionally to that assignment. Anyone can buy, sell, or trade their assigned water to any other entitlement holder, even across state lines. But to participate, you have to agree to take shortages proportionate to that assignment. The idea is, and I'm betting, could be wrong, I'm betting that entities are willing to trade prior appropriation water for assigned water, at least under some conditions. Yes, under this idea, sometimes you'd have to take a shortage haircut, and that's not great. But the rest of the time, you can do whatever the holy hell you want with your water, including selling it to the highest bidder, if that's what you want to do with it. No restrictions. It would be a way to fund consumptive use reductions without relying on federal appropriations. And it would be a way for cities who maybe don't have access to a lifeboat to buy a lifeboat. So it could bring multiple benefits. Not everyone will want to undertake this trade. For some people, that prior appropriation water is extraordinarily valuable and they don't want to trade ICS for it. That's okay. This would theoretically be voluntary. But the general idea is that if you want to benefit from the infrastructure that was collectively built to store private water, you have to share in the burden of building collective resiliency. Thank you. Oh.
That was great, Catherine. Thank you. This, I gotta get out of here.
While Mark is doing that, I just want to say I also am not Bob Dylan. We have collectively agreed that John Fleck, who's not able to be with us today, is Bob Dylan. So, I aspire to be George Harrison. Okay. Okay, so I am going to talk about a possible conservation program in the Upper Basin and what that might look like, what some of the barriers are. And I want to preface this by saying that just as an example, the state of Colorado has conducted a years-long investigation into a demand management program with 7 task forces of 10 to 20 people each that, after a couple of years, produced a 200-page report. And I have 20 minutes. So I'm just trying to set your expectations here. I'm going to hit the highlights. I want to also say that when Catherine talks about an assigned water program in the lower basin, I think of that as your neighborhood savings bank. You can wander in, you can withdraw some of your savings, you can do an electronic transfer. It's seamless, it's really easy. In the Upper Basin, it's like we have our savings bank in Antarctica and no electronic transfer capability. It is way far away from where people would actually be able to withdraw the water and use it at some later time. It serves a different purpose, and we have to think about that. So in crafting an Upper Basin conserved water program, we first have to think about what is the purpose? What is our goal? And there can be different answers to that question. Maybe we're trying to create system water and just balance the system, use less water, and create a better balance between supply and demand overall. Maybe it's insurance against a lower basin compact call, where there would be a bank of water stored in Lake Powell or somewhere that could be used to meet compact obligations. Maybe, as has been proposed in the draft EIS that came out in January, a bank in the Upper Basin could be used to partially offset lower basin shortages. Maybe it's something else. But that's a threshold question, and how we answer that question is going to govern what the structure and the rules look like. So, as I said, people have been thinking about this for a long time. There have been water bank discussions and arguments going on in Colorado, at least, for 20 years. We have the System Conservation Pilot Program, which is a conserved water program. And that started in 2018, and we've learned a lot from that. We also have had various different demand management program investigations in the Upper Basin states pursuant to the Demand Management Storage Agreement, which tells us some of the parameters of a demand management program in the Upper Basin. So we've got a lot of history with this, but we don't yet have a basin-wide Upper Basin conservation program. But we have a lot of work that we could build on. The UCRC and Chuck Cullum did a ton of work on this lessons learned report. What did we learn from several years of operating the System Conservation Pilot Program in the Upper Basin? How did people like participating in it? What were the problems? How can we do it better? That's a good report from 2023. And then Colorado did do this demand management feasibility investigation and did an update report in 2022, I think, and those are all available online. So we have a good start. But there are some sort of baseline issues that any Upper Basin conservation program has to deal with. And I want to talk about those by using a very simple example. And this is going to be rudimentary to some of you, but I want to make sure that we're all on the same page. So here we have a river that starts in the mountains and goes to the place where we want to have the water stored, the conserved water stored. Probably Lake Powell, could be Blue Mesa, could be Lake Mead, as we heard earlier today. Okay, so this is my farm. It is, I have a 10 CFS water rate with a 1905 priority, and I use that water to irrigate my 500 acres, and that generates 500 acre feet of consumptive use. And there are other water rights upstream and downstream, various different priorities. Obviously, this is simplified. There would be hundreds, if not thousands, of water rights upstream from me, maybe downstream from me as well. But I have decided to fallow half of my land. So I'm going to fallow 250 acres. I'm going to save 250 acre feet of consumptive use, and I'm only going to divert and use 5 CFS of my 10 CFS water right. So the first issue is I have to get my water right to my head gate. And in order to do that, saving that water has to be a beneficial use. So I can pull my 5 CFS down that I'm using on my land, clearly. I've been doing that for years. But the 5 CFS that I'm saving, unless that is determined to be a beneficial use under my state's water law, I can't call it to my head gate. So any of these guys upstream can pick it up. And then, if I can have it be seen as a beneficial use, so I can call it to my head gate, then I have to get it to where I want it to go, that 250 acre feet of consumptive use. And that is what we call shepherding. So that also depends on whether the saved water is a beneficial use, but I also have to have the help of the state engineer or the water administrator to get it from my head gate, where it used to be used, all the way to where I want it to go, Lake Powell or whatever. So first concept is beneficial use, and as we all know, it's like the fundamental concept in Western water law. And we have this quote that you see in various different court cases that beneficial use is the basis, the measure, and the limit of the water right. And this all comes from, Western water law that started in the 19th century, where the whole point was exploitation of the resource. We're trying to use this water beneficially and economically, and that's where we get the concept of use it or lose it. If you're not using that water, then somebody else can make economic use of it, and you don't get to have it anymore. And if you're not using it, there can be abandonment or forfeiture problems. So beneficial use is a really fundamental concept. But that definition of beneficial use has changed over time when new uses come into being, like snowmaking, like fracking, like in-stream flows. So we've seen that evolution of how people think about beneficial uses. So why not conserved water? But we're not fully there yet. So we do have questions that remain in most of the upper basin states about whether conserving water would be considered a beneficial use. There have been efforts to overcome this specific problem. There are a couple of Colorado statutes that say that if you're participating in a sanctioned conservation program, then you're not subject to abandonment of your water right, and the historical consumptive use is not reduced. And those are statutes that have been on the books for a long time. New Mexico has its strategic water reserve, and one of the purposes of that strategic water reserve is to hold and use the water to assist in complying with interstate compacts. Okay, sounds good. Utah has its agricultural optimization program where you can apply for grants from the state to help agricultural producers reduce their use of water. And that type of reduction with appropriate safeguards is specifically considered a beneficial use. So that statute, which is relatively recent, 2022, in Utah, is specifically designed to address the beneficial use question. And then Wyoming has the most recent effort to deal with this issue in the pilot water conservation program. That was just enacted this March, and it deals specifically with compact compliance and says that it's focused on the Colorado River Basin. And the goal is to avoid curtailment and to help Wyoming meet its compact obligations. It provides protection from abandonment, and it also provides for storage and release of water in Fontenelle Reservoir. So these are evolutionary processes, and we're coming to a point where the sort of fundamental problems have been solved, but not entirely, and certainly not throughout the Upper Basin. Okay, so shepherding. Two different aspects of shepherding. One is intrastate, one is interstate. For intrastate, that's where we go back to that diagram. We have to get the water from the point where it used to be diverted and used and pass it down without diversion by others to the place where we want to store it. That's probably going to take state engineer rules, and it may also require infrastructure improvements, because if we have a diversion dam that sweeps the river, how are you going to bypass and get my 5 CFS or my 250 acre feet down to where I want it to go? So there may have to be a bypass structure constructed or some engineering fix of some kind. So who pays for that? These are questions that we have to answer. And we also have to answer the possibility of objections from downstream users. And that's going to be all about how have we measured the historical consumptive use, and did we get it right? And that makes me think of the earlier talk about the Shoshone diversion, and because that's all about historical consumptive use and who's right about what that was. And if you don't get it right, then you can have adverse impacts on both upstream and downstream water rights. So issues around intrastate shepherding, interstate shepherding. So if in Colorado I save my 250 acre feet and want to get it to Lake Powell, I have to pass it across the state line, and Utah has to cooperate. And so we need an interstate agreement that recognizes conserved water in one state and provides for administrative shepherding to the place where we want it to go. There's going to be issues around transit losses. There's going to be issues around how you measure it, and is everybody using a consistent type of measurement process. And then, once I get it to Lake Powell, whose water is it then? Do we need separate accounts for each state? And those are thorny, I think, compact issues. And there's some other issues. Measurement and accounting and verification of conservation, those are difficult problems. And I was thinking when I was listening to Scott Campbell talking about the efficiency improvements in the Uncompahgre Valley, how do you measure the water savings from those efficiencies? And there can be arguments about that. And once you've made those efficiency improvements, do the water savings continue forever, or do they sort of phase out over time? Those are issues we have to answer. Who administers the program? Is it the UCRC? Is it the Colorado Water Conservation Board and the equivalents in the other states? Is it the state engineers? Who's paying? Big question. There has been federal money available, but we can't count on that forever. How do we set up a funding mechanism? Operational neutrality, once we get the water to Lake Powell or wherever we're keeping it, is it going to count for purposes of determining what the releases are from Lake Powell or the storage vessel? I think in most cases, we would want operational neutrality so that that water sort of floats on top of whatever the elevations are that trigger different releases. And then, interestingly, each one of the 4 Upper Basin states has an anti-export statute about water that places restrictions on use of water from one state in another. And so we have to get past those barriers. And there are ways to do this. There are exceptions in those statutes, and they can be changed legislatively. But I think the point is that state legislation will probably be required to deal with a lot of these unanswered questions. And then I just want to talk for a little bit about how you determine or what factors you might consider in determining what water rates are suitable for a conservation program. And one factor that has been used in previous programs is a history of consumptive use. And if you're trying to generate savings in the system, you're trying to make sure that the conserved water was really used before, and now that it's being conserved, that's a decrease in overall demand. Now, I also want to point out that I'm not suggesting that there should not, well, I don't want to preclude discussions about compensation or benefit to tribal entities that have unused or undeveloped water rights. I think that is a very important issue to address, and discussions are ongoing about that kind of program, and Celine will talk about that more. But if the goal is to reduce existing consumptive use, then the unused portion of a tribal water right is not the right fit for that kind of program. Needs a different kind of program that just deals with that. And then again, can you get the water to where we want it to go? I mean, because shepherding has been an issue and not possible in some of the Upper Basin states, that has limited the areas where conserved water has been accomplished to areas that are close to the state line, or at least not upstream from a whole bunch of other people who are going to divert that water. And if you have storage, you can store the conserved water and then release it at times when there's not many diversions going on. But the ability to get the water to where we want it to go is one of the factors that has to be considered. And then the quantity of water saved, I think, is an issue too. And this is just economies of scale. You know, saving 10 acre feet if you have to go through a change of water right case and get state engineer approval and do a contract and all this kind of stuff, is it worth it for 10 acre feet? Is it worth it to the whatever entity is administering the conserved water program? And the quantity involved also bears on the accounting and verification, because increasingly we can use satellite technology to measure the ET coming off fields, and we can use that to figure out how much water was saved, how much consumptive use was reduced. But the resolution of the satellite imagery is like 30 meters. And so you can't do an acre plot with that kind of resolution. So that's another thing that we have to consider. Ease or difficulty of verification. And then one of the things that the SCPP looked at was multiple benefits. If we keep this water in the stream, Does it help riparian ecology? Does it help fish? Does it help endangered fish? Does it provide recreation? And so if there are multiple benefits, that should be a factor in favor of a particular water right participating in a consumptive use program. And then finally, these are some of the factors that would be considered by potential participants in a conserved water program. And I derive a lot of this from the lessons learned report that the UCRC did. Economics, obviously, who's going to pay me and how much, and is it worth it? Is it an administrative hassle for me as a water right owner? And then what are the impacts on my land and my soil after I get out of the conservation program? Is it going to be harder to grow the stuff I want to grow? Will there be sort of a period of building back up to the same crop productivity that I had before? And CSU has been doing a lot of work on these kinds of issues. And Perry Cabot in particular, and in concert with some West Slope farmers and ranchers to look at exactly this issue. And then finally, what happens, and this was one of the questions to the previous panel, what happens to the water I save? Does it get picked up by some random diverter? Does it allow for additional use in the lower basin? And that's like, don't want to do that. Or does the Colorado River system benefit, and any risk of curtailment to me and everybody else goes down? And that's the one we want, right? That's the one we want to have people feel that is their reason for participating in the conserved water program. And I've always thought that a conservation program would be a hedge against a potential compact call. You could release conserved water from an account in Lake Powell and use that to help meet compact obligations. And that means things like, like I was saying at the beginning, the purpose defines the structure. That means operational neutrality. That means separate accounts for the different upper basin states. But if the upper basin legal position is that we don't have a volumetric obligation at Lee Ferry, that has significant impacts on what a conservation program looks like. And I think, personally, I think we still need one as a way to meet compact obligations that would hopefully be some diminished requirement at Lee Ferry, or even better, a percentage split of natural flow between the two basins, but also as a way to reduce overall use, overall demand in the basin, hopefully as a bridge to more permanent reductions of use. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Mark. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Celine Hawkins, and I work with the Nature Conservancy, which is one of the conservation organizations that works all across the Colorado River Basin, including in Mexico, and with other conservation groups, and for today's purposes, also with tribal nations across the basin. So when I was preparing for this panel, I was thinking back to a couple of meetings that I had in a different part of my career when I was working on the first basin study in about 2010. And they were two meetings that still stick with me to this day. One of them was with Carly Zurla and her team, where we were really wrestling with questions about when tribal water becomes system water. And I remember that being a very tense conversation with her team that day. And then I also remember a conversation where the 10 Tribes Partnership was briefed by the Bureau of Reclamation about how ICS worked in the lower basin. And through those conversations, I really started to learn that the design of programs that we are building in the basin to handle water stress really matter, and they really matter if you care about the health of the river, and they really matter if you think about tribal water, which has some unique attributes. We already heard a little bit about this from Anne, but it's worth noting that in the Colorado River Basin, we saw the first quantification of tribal water rights in the 1960s during the Arizona versus California litigation. But many of the settlements of water rights happened much later than that, and some of them are still being negotiated now. So these water rights are quite different, but tribes have also not had the opportunity to fully develop their water rights. So when we're looking at ways to balance water supply in the system, we need to think really hard about the history and the development of tribal water use, and also how powerful tribal water rights are. They are often very senior water rights. They cannot be lost through abandonment or forfeiture. And in many of the negotiated settlements, tribal nations have quite large allocations of storage water, which can be very useful if you're looking for ways to soften the blow in the system. Later in my career, when I was serving on the Colorado Water Conservation Board, I sort of expanded my thinking about design of the programs when I was guiding the demand management feasibility studies. And there I sort of rounded out my thinking about program design by really thinking about how these programs can harm and benefit rural communities, and again, what they can do to either mitigate harm to rivers or even provide co-benefits. So I get to be here today to talk to you about some of the ideas that have been offered by conservation groups and tribal nations to sort of add on to what you've already heard from the other panelists. But before I start that, I wanted to share with you all some conversations that I had with some of the scientists that have been working for the conservation groups about how important these flexible tools or conservation programs are given the enormous challenge that we've spent the day learning about. And I was having back and forth with my colleague Joe Trungale, and he was saying, you just have to be careful because the bottom of the cake, the carrot cake, is really the operational decisions that the basin state negotiators are wrestling with. And those are, when are we going to take cuts, who takes cuts, and how we're managing reservoirs. But then there's this back and forth about how important the flexible tools can be, especially in years like 2026 when we're right up against some hard margins. And so I offer you a cake metaphor, which is that these flexible tools, they're not just additions that we put on top of the operations, but they are in fact the frosting on the cake. And what I mean by that is if you take the frosting off this cake, it is just a muffin. It's not as good. And the frosting is also the best part. It's where you can be creative. It's really sweet. And so I would offer that the cake that we're trying to bake in the Colorado River Basin will be better if we have both the foundational operations and the flexible tools that allow us all the room for creativity moving forward. So this is where we're going to proactively and strategically deploy water in the system. This is where we can be innovative. And as I talk about some examples today, I hope that you'll see that this year, most of our conversation has been about hard trade-offs in emergency management. When we're thinking about how these flexible programs might operate, there is so much more that we can do. So as we're moving into a framework this year where we're going to be sort of planning for the future of the basin, if we want more creative, flexible, and durable solutions, we should be paying attention to these flexible tools. So I'm going to continue the cake metaphor here, because there's actually a ton of ideas that have been put forth by conservation organizations and tribal nations into the process around the interim guidelines. So there's actually quite a few flavors of this frosting. So we have seen ideas from conservation groups of a conservation reserve that actually allows for some flexibility between Lake Powell and Lake Mead. We have also seen ideas that were put into some of the alternatives analyzed by the Bureau of Reclamation by tribal nations, where there's an expanded role for tribal water in some of the savings pools in the basin. We have seen upper basin tribal nations put forward ideas about how we could create upper basin conservation programs that will empower tribal nations to participate in solutions. And we also saw the upper basin tribal nations that offered those ideas partner with conservation groups to really flesh out some ideas on how those programs might work. We have seen new proposals from tribal nations in the lower basin in the most recent 3-state proposal. And there are some concepts around pools in the Northern Arizona Indian Water Rights Settlement Agreement. So of course, with the time that I have today, I probably can't give you the details of sort of how all those flavors work. And so what I wanted to do was to ask anybody who has worked on any of these proposals to put your hand up, whether you're in this room or in one of the other rooms, so that at happy hour, other people can come and get the details, because it's pretty, like they're pretty detailed. It would be like a whole happy hour discussion to understand how any of these programs work. So you may still be wondering why tribal nations and conservation groups have clearly spent a lot of time, resources, and energy working together on ideas for water conservation programs. And so I wanted to provide a little bit more context for that. So thinking about the tribal water and some of the unique attributes that I explained at the beginning of the talk. Past tools and programs that we have built in the Colorado River Basin to handle water stress have admittedly not been designed well for tribal participation. I think it is worth noting that we have still seen significant tribal participation in many of these programs. But if we were able to design the programs to be more inclusive of tribal solutions, we are going to see even more tribal participation in solutions. And we have been hearing this from tribal nations across the basin for at least a decade. So we know that there's a real desire, but we need to make sure that we remove some of the barriers to tribal participation in these programs. So if we're having to design new programs, now is a time to do it in a way so that they work for tribal partners. We also have really significant opportunities to improve the health of the river itself through the design of these programs. So because they are proactive, because they're flexible, we can design in ways for these to become win-win, where the same drops of water that are moving around the system can do good things to buffer the impacts of drought, fires, and floods, and take care of the fish, wildlife, and everything else that depends on the Colorado River. And I wanted to give you a really tangible example of what this might look like in practice. So I've talked before at this conference about the water sharing agreement between the Hickory Apache Nation, the New Mexico Interstate Stream Commission, and the Nature Conservancy. And this is an agreement where the Hickory Apache Nation's water is being leased to the state of New Mexico, enrolled in the Strategic Water Reserve, which is one of the programs that Ann mentioned, and we are releasing water into the San Juan River this summer through this program. So this water is being released from a reservoir. It is on its way to Lake Powell as we speak. But even more so, we have doubled the flow of the main stem of the San Juan River through this release. So today, if we were not releasing water under that agreement, we would have at least half less water in the river. And if you're a fish trying to make it in the San Juan River in this incredibly hot year, that could make a difference between whether you live or die. So these are really important considerations if you care about the health of the river and everything else that it depends on. So as we move into decisions about the Colorado River, I would urge us to keep some frosting on the cake. Let's think about reducing long-term risk. Let's make sure we're increasing our adaptability, that we're lowering barriers to tribal solutions, and keeping as much room as we can for flexibility and innovation during this hard time. Thank you.
Okay, I think Jason is going to offer some questions from the audience. Jason, can you help us?
I can try. Celine ditched me, and I was thinking how comical and amazing if maybe like she could come up here and pose the questions and then run back, you know? But I don't think she's down for that. I don't want to speak for her, but I'm not feeling it. Yeah. All right. There were two questions that were neck and neck in the queue, and one of them is the one posed to Brad Udall at the outset of our initial session. And since we have two Colorado water lawyers on this panel, I don't want to detract too much, but it's obviously of interest to the audience, both in person and online. And so I wanted to mention it again. I'll just state the question as it's posed in the queue. Colorado has declared free river conditions during this extraordinary drought. Can you comment on how this aligns with the need to reduce use and conservation?
Do you want to go?
Go first.
The thing is about Free River, it might exist for a day. It might exist on a stream reach that's 5 miles long. I don't know what the context is. So I've understood that there are free river conditions sort of momentarily in some places, but also, as Amy Moyer said earlier, maybe the reason they exist is because somebody is doing extraordinary releases from a reservoir upstream to try to take a call off the system and let everybody operate the way they're accustomed to operating. I don't know. I do know that it's not a great look to say free river in this kind of year. And I think that it raises questions about the general appropriations in the Colorado River system, the upper basin states, and how long we will allow new appropriations to take place on the river. So I'm going to duck the question because I really don't know what the underlying facts are.
I think I would add a couple of things. One, that at this point, nobody should be relying on free river conditions for a solid water supply. There just simply isn't enough reliability, even in the state of Colorado, to be sort of planning your economic future on there being that kind of water in the river. The other thing I would say is that we have seen progress in the state of Colorado on measurement rules. I know it was a big deal in the geography where I live in the state for the state engineer to come and really figure out how we're going to get proper measurement and accounting devices on some of the tributaries to the Colorado River. So we can't really implement things well if we can't measure the water. And I do think that as a state, we're starting to make progress on that.
Okay, thanks so much for fielding that. Really appreciate it. The remainder of the questions in the queue are all interstate in nature. And I'd be remiss not to just acknowledge most of them are upper basin focused. So as a facilitator, I'm going to do my best to...
I'm okay with that.
Leave it. No, I'm going to do my best to try to couch them in basin-wide or even lower basin terms, but I'll try. So in that spirit, the next question I did want to run by Catherine, if that would be all right. There's, with Colorado River Management, the who is engaged in decision-making over Colorado River Management, and the how, the process of it, and then there's the what, the solutions, right? And so as a segue, the question is is the thinking and negotiating around water conservation actually more painful than the solutions themselves?
Yes, but what choice do we have? I meant what I said when I was trying to be serious. It makes me just terribly sad that we're at a place where we have to make these awful, awful trade-offs. But we don't have a choice, and I think that going through the pain of discussing different conservation measures, who's impacted, how much that hurts, relative uses, is also just as a process useful because we learn each other's perspectives and we learn lessons. So I think there's value in that, but yeah, it's awful, yeah.
And I sure appreciate the muffins or chihuahuas slide after that very serious, sober piece of your presentation. Okay. I think that provides a good segue for an Upper Basin focused question. And not to say, Catherine, if you want to chime in on it, by all means, but.
I'm happy to speak for the Upper Basin anytime. It's not a problem.
Yeah, keep it feisty, right? So again, in the spirit of thinking about process and decision making, and as well as the solutions themselves, trying to find a way to frame this question that isn't too confrontational, but there's concerns about Upper Basin willingness, political willingness, to work towards conservation. If conservation is the solution, if the solution is for every state to reduce consumptive use, the question is, why aren't the Upper Basin states willing to work towards that? And I'll add one other thing, and then I'll cede the floor. Corollary question was basically, what do you see as the federal role in trying to facilitate that political willingness for Upper Basin water conservation? The latter part of the question connects to Tina Shields' presentation earlier describing the federal role vis-a-vis the quantification settlement agreement. So there it is.
Take that one first. I'll follow up.
Can I take a stab at it as long as we're hemming and hawing about how to answer? I mean, it's a really important question, and I think the answer lies in part with the comment that Ann made in the middle of her talk, which is, we need to decide how we're going to divide up the water in the two basins. I mean, because right now there's this sort of myth or sort of sense, I think, that some in the Upper Basin have, that there is an opportunity to continue to use water because we have a right to 7.5 million acre feet or something more than what we're using right now. If we were to divide the river, and I agree with Ann that ideally, maybe by percentages, we would have a much better sense of how much water we had to deliver to Lee's Ferry. And then we would have to act accordingly. And so, right now there's this uncertainty. What is our obligation to deliver? And without some clearer sort of indication, and I guess the Bureau might be the only entity in a position to help us here if the states can't reach an agreement. But ideally the states would reach an agreement about how we're dividing it up and what we owe at Lee's Ferry to the lower basin, and then we could, I hope, manage our water on that basis. But I'd be interested to hear Ann or Celine's maybe response or comment on that.
Well, I am going to duck the question about why we don't have a program yet. But what I will say is that many of the Upper Basin states do have tools and programs. So the tool that I talked about, the New Mexico Strategic Water Reserve, is a super cool, flexible, innovative tool for managing water in the state of New Mexico. Utah's program, which is a little bit newer, again, is innovative and I think is really going to be game-changing in terms of how we conserve water in the basin. And then just this year, the state of Wyoming passed their first program. And so while we may not have a program that solves all of the problems, including shepherding, I do think that we're going to need some flexibility for these programs to work in the specific states and for tribal nations in ways that can flex a little bit to context. So I understand that that's maybe not the progress at the pace that we need, but I am seeing progress in thinking through how this will work in the Upper Basin.
And I don't want to pretend that I can get in the heads of the state negotiators, and I do think they have incredibly difficult jobs. Mm-hmm. And their jobs are to be responsible to their constituencies and to preserve to the best extent they can their constituents' water rights. And that job, that purpose, can be directly at odds with a compromise solution. And I think that's very difficult to overcome, and I don't envy those in their positions. But I do think that we have such a continuing disparity between supply and demand. I mean, that is what the paper that Catherine and I and others just wrote. 2.5 million acre feet, probably, on average over the last few years. That's a lot of water that we're using more than nature supplies. And in order to fill that gap, which we must, I don't see how you can do it either mathematically or politically, particularly politically, without all 7 basin states participating. In every sector of the economy, each state, each basin, everybody. So I think that needs to happen. Part of the question was about what Reclamation and Interior can or should do. And I think we'll hear from Scott about how that's likely to go, and we'll all know that answer pretty soon. But the problem is that Interior's authorities are limited, and they can't craft the same kind of equitable solution that the states can and distribute the burden of these reduced supplies in an equitable way. And I know that equitable is a weasel word, but Interior's authorities are particularly strong in the lower basin and not in the upper basin, and that can create inequities. And so I think as a whole, we would be way better off if we don't have to rely on Interior for a solution.
Fair enough.
Okay, thank you very much. The next question, to shift things back to the basin-wide level, I think connects pretty directly with Professor Squillace Mark's comments a second ago, and that is, if we were to transition for purposes of the apportionment to a percentage-based apportionment system, would conservation programs even be necessary? And to be fair to the person who posed the question, they asked it in the context of just the upper basin, but I'm going to exercise facilitator's prerogative and make that basin-wide. If we were to move towards a percentage-based apportionment system within the U.S. portion of the basin, what impact would that have on conservation programs?
So, I think they would, because if nothing else, they create these amazing lifeboats and flexibility in transactions that is really valuable, I think, in both basins. So, I know there's a lot of focus on the idea of percentage splits. Maybe that works and maybe it doesn't, but I don't view that a fixed versus percentage-based allocation as the main problem. I just think that hydrology has been so tough that even if it were a percentage-based split, I think we'd still be sitting here today without a 7-state solution. I think hydrology has just been so challenging, and a lot of the Wilbury paper talks about the ratchet effect, And, we have these dry years, and then there's maybe a wet one, and then several more dry years, and we all know what's happened to storage over that time. And the negotiators, certainly the states of the lower basin have done huge work to try to slow the decline in those reservoirs. And it unfortunately hasn't been enough. And so I just think hydrology is so challenging that I'm not sure focusing on whether it's percentage-based or fixed allocation is really the heart of the issue.
And I would say, too, that whatever the obligation is, if it's percentage or something different, you would want the flexibility of a stored water bank to buffer really challenging situations. So if it is a percentage-based allocation, it's still going to be hard in some years to meet that percentage. Mm-hmm. And so if you have some savings in the bank through a conserved water program, you can much more flexibly operate through those different allocations as they change over time. And I think, it doesn't matter if it's percentage-based, but the problem that we're facing right now is that we have this sort of fixed volume in the compact, and that just doesn't work anymore in the hydrology that we're seeing today. So I think having the flexibility and the buffer that a conserved water bank provides is always going to be beneficial.
I would agree. I think we still want frosting on that cake.
Well said.
Okay, thank you so much. The next question has a compact piece to it as well. It's different, though. It seems like a lot of the questions so far have thought about conservation as it bears on avoiding a potential compact violation at Leaf Ferry, right? This one is post that. So this question is posed in terms of the tools available in the upper basin. And this is the way the person who posed the question phrased it: the tools available in the upper basin when there is a compact call requiring upper basin states to deliver water downstream of PAL. What role do you see conservation playing in the context of a compact call having been made?
I think it depends on how much lead time we have. So theoretically, you build a conservation program, whether it's basin-wide or upper basin, and it's really hard to fill that pool in a year like 2026 where we're so short on water. So you need some time, and you need some of those bigger years where we have more flexibility to kind of build that buffer. So for me, it's going to depend on whether we've proactively built the programs and started filling that pool, where I think it could, if designed in a certain way, be a buffer or a tool for managing compact compliance. But we can't do it fast. So we can't get to the year that we have compact litigation or a call and expect to be able to build that pool when we're in crisis.
Yeah, and I guess if we were in a compact call situation, then the UCRC makes a determination about which state is responsible for how much, and then the state engineers implement curtailment, up the system for at least post-compact water rights. And I can see market forces taking over at that point and incentivizing conservation that would help to meet and offset curtailment.
Sorry about that. Thank you. The other questions have to do with a big surprise connected to potential compact violations, Lake Powell. And so I think this is for everyone, but certainly for the upper basin folks. The prospect of Lake Powell serving as a water bank is the general focus of the two questions that I want to run through. One of them, I think, Anne, you touched on partially in your presentation, but it is why didn't the Upper Basin states ever activate a water bank in Lake Powell? And the second question, just to keep things interesting, because I tell you, is concerns whether or not Lake Powell should be used as a water bank at all. And that is, other than by virtue of signaling, why would the Upper Basin states contribute to lower basin shortages when pardon me, I messed that up. What is the benefit of storing water in Lake Powell while Lake Mead can now store 3 times of what's in Lake Powell and 2 times of all water in the Upper Basin CRISP initial units? So take it whichever direction you'd like.
Well, I can start with that. The demand management storage agreement was part of the drought contingency plan in 2019, and it provided for sort of steps that the Upper Basin states could take to investigate the feasibility of a demand management program. It wasn't solely focused on a bank in Lake Powell, but that would be certainly maybe the best possibility. And the various states have undertaken those investigations to various degrees. And I describe Colorado's very, very extensive demand management investigation. It's not easy. I mean, I tried to list some of the many factors that are involved in setting up an Upper Basin demand management program. And I think, I can certainly be corrected, and I would like to be corrected, but I think if the Upper Basin state's position is that there is not an obligation at Lee Ferry because of climate change, then having that bank in Lake Powell doesn't seem urgent and maybe not necessary at all. So that, I struggled with that, really. I wonder, and there are people in this room who could answer that question, I think. But I think that might be part of the calculus if that's your legal position.
I'm okay with Phil Mead first.
Elaborate?
No.
Okay. Then unless, Celine, do you have something on that topic?
I'll just add a note that the conservation reserve idea that's embedded in the maximum operational flexibility, favorite name ever alternative, does allow water to move between Mead and Powell. So there are flexibilities we can build in with that kind of movement. But there are implications between the upper and lower basin that need to be addressed for that to work.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks so much. Sorry to the panelists and the folks who posed those questions about misconflating them like I did. I'm doing my best, but I apologize for that. Going back to Catherine to spread things around, you'll love it because you love assigned water. There are a couple ICS questions in the queue. Questions about intentionally created surplus, and I think, I don't want to speak for the folks posing them, how to do it better. So one of the ICS questions is public facing. Would you agree that more information needs to be publicly available regarding ICS? And if so, what information should be available and why? That's the first one. The second one is any ideas on how to make existing ICS operationally neutral? And if you want to break down the meaning of operationally neutral, that would be welcomed.
Sure. So I'm going to take the second one first. So operationally neutral basically means that the water is invisible in Lake Mead for purposes of determining releases from Lake Powell and also for purposes of determining shortage in the lower basin. That's generally what it means. You can quibble with that. So, yeah, I don't know of a way to make existing ICS operationally neutral unless someone is willing to endure a cut to make it so. And I've racked my brain on that. I hope someone else has a great idea on how to do it. The only other way to do it, maybe without serious consequences, would be to hope and wait that someday the reservoirs are high enough that you could convert it to operational neutrality, that no one suffers a shortage as a consequence. Let's hope that day comes. I don't know. And then, yeah, transparency, I think, is actually really important. And I think that there are some really important ways that the Bureau could improve the reporting on ICS just to make it understandable. And I got to tell you, I've probably spent as much time on ICS as any human outside the Bureau of Reclamation. And even for me, it's really hard to find all the appropriate documents and the data. And sometimes ICS is corrected after the fact, and you have to look in footnotes from previous, water years to even find it. And that's frustrating, but the importance of transparency is that I want assigned water to work. I think it is incredibly valuable, but if there is not transparency and trust, then over time it won't succeed. And so I think that transparency is super important because we all need to have faith in these programs.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Mark, as moderator, I'm thinking we probably have time for one more because I know folks need a break, and we'll have Commissioner Cameron. Does that sound good?
Yep.
Okay. The last question's for Ann. And it has to do with water conservation efforts. The overarching statement that the person poses, it seems like the Upper Basin is still years away from a workable conservation program. What can be done? And that's the broad phrasing of it. I'll couple it with a second one. Why couldn't shepherded water be treated as in-stream flow under a state law, given that it's recognized as a beneficial use?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we could stand up a conservation program in the Upper Basin. And there are tons of complexities, and we're going to make some mistakes. So we would want to have a program that could correct itself and be changed and evolve over time as we learned how to deal with it. We have to want to do it. There have been some barriers to doing that, but I think we could stand it up relatively quickly if we have the will to do so. And what was the second question?
It's the beneficial use question, and I think it is.
Oh, shepherding.
Shepherding, could we facilitate that by
in-stream flow?
Yeah.
I think you probably could. If water is being shepherded, it is kind of like in-stream flow. At least in Colorado, the procedures that I'm familiar with, in order to get a water rate changed to include in-stream flow, is a big deal. And you might not need to do that because you got the water in the stream and it's going all the way to wherever you're trying to get it to go. So it's serving the same function. You may not need that sort of imprimatur of labeled in-stream flow to get there.
Thanks. We're going to go right into the next panel, but let's first thank this panel before we do so.